Flatards think just saying the word perspective solves all of their problems, even though we've just seen that their understanding of it is below that expected of someone graduating from using wax crayons as their writing implement of choice. In order for the sun to rise and set, you need a horizon, and you'll be unsurprised to hear that that's another thing that Flatards can't wrap their heads around. The Flatard version of perspective has to work like this. Instead of being able to see the ground stretching off into the distance for many thousands of kilometers, it forms a horizon at a much shorter distance. Our lights on poles stretch out to the mystery short-range horizon, and then equally mysteriously start disappearing below it, from the bottom of the poles up, until we can't see the lights anymore. This happens for everything on and above ground, including the sun, moon and stars. But hang on, we've already seen that the very simple geometry behind perspective just doesn't work this way. Lines parallel to the surface of Flatardia would run parallel to that surface forever. How can the surface of Flatardia even form a horizon, and how can objects be obscured by it? How could the red lights on Cletus' line of sight ever drop below his line of sight? How could anything above his line of sight ever be below it, or set below the horizon? These are all very good questions, which explains why they hadn't been asked by Flatards. Flatards clearly haven't thought this through, to nobody's surprise, but this can only mean one or both of two things for them. Either straight lines aren't straight, in which case this must also apply to the surface of Flatardia itself, in order for a short-range horizon to even form. In other words, their flat Earth isn't flat, by their own standards. Or parallel lines aren't parallel, because reasons. Regardless of whatever ad hoc bullshit Flatards want to cook up this time, to excuse themselves from having to actually think about their own stupidity, they're now in the position of having to claim that basic axioms of Euclidean geometry are magically false, whilst also claiming that Earth is flat and subject to Euclidean geometry, which basically means that Flatards are insane. Consider our Flatard in a really long corridor again. According to Flatard perspective, beyond a few miles he should no longer be able to see the floor of the corridor, and he should see more distant lights on the ceiling disappear below the horizon on the floor. Well, we've already established that this makes no geometric sense whatsoever, so let's reset the corridor. What if we hung our Flatard by his feet from the ceiling, put some lights on the floor, and rotated the camera so that it only appeared that our Flatard was stood on the floor? What would Flatard perspective do here? Where would the horizon be? On the floor? On the ceiling? What if we strapped our Flatard to a support on the wall and rotated the camera 90 degrees? Where would the horizon be now? On the floor? On the ceiling? On the wall? Which one? As we can see, the concept of a horizon with things disappearing behind it makes no sense in an environment comprised of flat surfaces. Yet Flatards claim that we do live on a flat surface, and that things are obscured by a horizon breaking the simple geometric principles we've seen. You see, the undocumented, unmodelled and utterly useless Flatard version of perspective has a preferred direction. This is odd, because lines of sight and perspective in reality work in any orientation. For example, if you were on the ground between some exceedingly tall buildings looking up, there is no distance at which one set of buildings would get a horizon, and the other will start being obscured by the horizon. If we were to take our lights on poles example from before, and set it on an enormously long ramp, which we could set at any angle, and have Cletus looking along the ramp, there is no distance at which the ramp would form a horizon behind which more distant poles and lights would start disappearing bottom first. And yet, Flatards expect you to believe that if we return the ramp to align with the ground of their fantasy frittata, you'll get a horizon a short distance away, mere kilometres, behind which objects will increasingly be obscured as they become more distant. Reality simply doesn't care what direction you're looking in. The Flatard version of perspective, which they're incapable of putting into words or mathematics, is quite simply bullshit. And like all ad hoc explanations they concoct in an attempt to sound like they know anything about anything, when their explanations can't even stand the most basic scrutiny, it's just another indicator that the idea of Earth being flat and having its own direction-specific version of perspective is bollocks.